She moved through Seattle General like a ghost with a clipboard. 2 years of careful invisibility, of keeping her head down in the fluorescent-lit corridors of Savannah's finest hospital, where the real work happened in the spaces between the doctor's rounds. Margaret Walsh folded linens in the supply room on the 3rd floor, her movements economical and precise, no wasted steps, no hesitation, hands that never trembled even during the midnight codes when the monitors screamed their electric warnings. The antiseptic smell clung to everything, that sharp bite of bleach and something metallic underneath, copper bright and familiar in ways she'd trained herself not to acknowledge. She'd learned long ago that survival meant becoming background noise, the kind of person people looked through rather than at. Her scrubs were navy blue, standard issue, wrinkled from a double shift that had started at 6 in the morning. It was now 8:30 at night, and the hospital had settled into that particular quiet that only comes when most visitors have gone home and the skeleton crew takes over. The linen she folded were white, industrial-grade cotton that had been washed so many times they'd gone soft as skin. 16 beds in the supply room. She counted them automatically, the way she counted everything now: exits, personnel, potential threats. Old habits. The kind that kept you alive in Helmand province didn't just disappear because you traded the desert for a hospital corridor in Georgia. Margaret was 47 years old, but the grey at her temples made her look 55, maybe 60 if the light was harsh enough. That was intentional. Grey hair and soft movements and a quiet voice that never carried past the immediate room, these were the tools of someone who'd learned that visibility was a liability. She'd spent 3 tours in the mountains of Afghanistan, and the last 2 years trying to disappear into the American healthcare system like a woman sinking slowly underwater. Her discharge papers said she was discharged. Her credentialing at Seattle General didn't mention her rank, her unit, her medals, or the 14 confirmed saves during Operation Copper Shadow. It just said RN with 23 years experience. That was the agreement. Vanish completely, or don't come back at all. The Pentagon had been very clear about that. The faded unit patch was hidden inside the lining of her jacket, stitched there with thread the color of old bone. 3rd Ranger Battalion. She touched it once each shift, morning and evening, a ritual so practiced it took maybe 2 seconds. Her fingers found it now, the pad of her thumb brushing across the embroidered letters while she stood alone among the linens and the hum of the hospital's air handling system. The patch was the only proof. Everything else had been erased from every database that mattered, Captain Margaret Walsh removed from the official record the same way you deleted a file. Witness protection, they'd called it. Erasure, she called it. Dr. James Pierce was watching her from the doorway. He did this sometimes, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, his Rolex catching the fluorescent light. 52 years old, chief of surgery, divorced twice, and the kind of man who'd been told his whole life that excellence was something he deserved rather than something he had to earn. Margaret saw him in her peripheral vision but didn't acknowledge his presence. She kept folding, fitted sheet into a tight rectangle, then into thirds, then into sixths. The motions were automatic, meditative. Her hands moved like they were following a script written long ago. What Pierce was calculating, what he was turning over in his mind like a tactical problem, was the problem of Margaret Walsh's meticulous charting. For 18 months, he'd been ordering equipment that occasionally never arrived, authorizing billing codes for supplies that had been slightly inflated, shaving small percentages off procurement requisitions and funneling the difference into accounts that didn't technically exist. Nothing massive. Nothing that would trigger red flags at the federal level. Just enough to supplement the salary that the hospital paid him, which he'd always considered insulting for someone of his caliber. But Margaret's charts, her triple-checked equipment logs, her precise inventory reconciliations, her habit of cross-referencing delivery dates with actual usage rates, Margaret's charts had started to create a paper trail that contradicted his. She hadn't reported anything yet. He'd checked. No whistleblower calls to compliance, no emails to the hospital's ethics committee, no anonymous tips to the FBI's healthcare fraud hotline. But she would. Eventually. The kind of precision that Margaret brought to every task suggested that she eventually reported everything. He'd observed her for long enough to know that about her. She was the type of nurse who caught medication errors that no one else noticed, who flagged documentation inconsistencies, who seemed to have this almost obsessive relationship with accuracy. It was admirable in a limited context. It was dangerous in his context. Margaret folded the last fitted sheet and placed it on the stack, 43 sheets, 3 layers high. The stack looked like something a sculptor had made, all perfect right angles and hospital-wide geometry. She moved to the pillowcases next, working through the bin methodically. The sound of pillowcases sliding against each other was soft, almost rhythmic. Pierce was still watching. She could hear his breathing, that particular breathing pattern of someone concentrating hard on something they didn't quite understand. Men like Pierce rarely understood the people who worked beneath them. They saw staff as interchangeable parts, functions rather than human beings. Margaret had learned to be very functional. Her hands had scars on them that she kept hidden under long sleeves, even in the Georgia summer. Burn marks from a helicopter rotor wash in Kandahar. A jagged line on her left palm from a piece of shrapnel that had gone in clean and come out through her wrist. The scar tissue was white, silvery in certain light, and she'd gotten very good at explaining it away. Kitchen accident when she was 19. Fell into a fryer. The lie was smooth and practiced, and nobody ever asked follow-up questions. People generally didn't want to know. They wanted the surface explanation, the acceptable narrative, the version of Margaret that fit into their understanding of what a hospital nurse should be. But Dr. Pierce was starting to see something that made him uncomfortable. He couldn't quite identify it. It was the way she moved, economical, deliberate, with a precision that seemed almost military. It was the way her eyes tracked the room when she thought no one was looking, cataloguing exits and personnel and potential hazards. It was something in her bearing that suggested she'd carried weight that most people would have crumbled under. None of this made sense for a woman who folded linens and organized charts and kept her head down. It didn't fit into his model of who she was supposed to be. "The equipment inventory from last month," he said. His voice was conversational, the way a surgeon's voice could be before they cut into something delicate. Margaret turned slowly. "You noticed some discrepancies." She met his eyes with a flat stare that contained no emotion whatsoever. "The 14-gauge angiocath needles," she said. Her voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you listen harder. "The order said 40 units. The delivery slip says 50. The usage log says 32. That's an 8-unit gap. Plus the satin sky clamps, ordered 4, delivered 5, logged as 4. And the Reboa balloons from the trauma bay, that's the biggest one. Ordered 12, delivery says 8, current inventory is 6. 2 units just missing from the system." Pierce felt something shift in his chest, a small cold thing like a stone dropping into dark water. "You're thorough," he said. "That's the job," Margaret said. She turned back to the pillowcases. Her hands resumed their work without hesitation. Documentation has to be accurate. Otherwise nobody knows what actually happened. He stood there for another moment, understanding settling over him like a frost. She knew. She might not have reported it yet, but she was looking. She was tracking it. Her meticulous mind was building the case, piece by piece, and eventually she would reach the point where she couldn't not report it. It wasn't about being a whistleblower for Margaret. It was about accuracy, about truth, about the kind of discipline that made people trust her. The kind of discipline that was going to destroy him if he didn't act first. What Pierce didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly understand, looking at her in her wrinkled scrubs with her grey hair and her soft voice and her careful movements, was that Margaret had spent 12 years training her mind to anticipate threats before they manifested. She'd spent 3 tours identifying patterns that meant the difference between her team walking out of a valley alive or not walking out at all. She could track 17 different variables simultaneously and predict outcomes with the kind of accuracy that saved lives. And what she'd identified 2 weeks ago, when she noticed the first discrepancy in Dr. Pierce's equipment orders, was that someone was doing something they shouldn't be doing, and that this someone had access to the hospital's entire supply chain, and that this someone was getting nervous about being discovered. She could see it in the way he stood. She could hear it in the particular quality of his breathing. She could feel it in the space between them, that electrical charge that happens when two people are thinking about the same problem but reaching different conclusions about what to do about it. Pierce turned and left the supply room. She watched him go without turning her head, just tracking his movement through the edges of her vision. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electronic drone. Somewhere on the 4th floor, a patient monitor began its alarm pattern, 3 short beeps, a pause, 3 more. Nothing emergency, just a reminder that someone needed attention. Margaret folded the last pillowcase and set it on top of the stack. 42 pillowcases. The linen bins were empty now. The supply room was organized and ready for the night shift to begin their work, back where it had started 2 years ago when she'd walked through these doors with her discharge papers and her fake civilian identity and her promise to disappear completely. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was something that was happening right now, across town, in a private hospital room on the east side of Savannah, where a man who'd once led her unit, Colonel Marcus Davis, decorated Marine, decorated operator, the commander who'd pulled her out of the rubble in Jalabad, was checking himself into the emergency room with a pain in his chest that was spreading down his left arm. He had no idea. Neither did Dr. Pierce. Neither did anyone else in this hospital. But Margaret Walsh, standing alone in the supply room at 8:45 on a Tuesday evening, she knew something was about to change. She could feel it the way you feel a storm coming, that particular pressure drop in the air that means the weather is about to turn violent. She touched the patch inside her jacket one more time and went back to work. The amphitheater was full. 60 residents, 20 attendings, the kind of crowd that made grand rounds feel like a performance rather than education. Margaret stood in the back, her presence about as noticed as a shadow, when Dr. Pierce began his slide presentation. The patient chart appeared on the screen behind him, one of hers, a 73-year-old woman with septic shock that Margaret had triaged 4 days ago. Every note was precise. Every vital sign documented. Every intervention tracked with timestamps. Pierce circled the screen with his laser pointer, the red dot dancing across her handwriting like a target. "Notice the excessive documentation here," he said, his voice carrying the tone of a man explaining something to children. "This is what happens when nurses rely on outdated triage protocols from the previous century. See the redundancy? The multiple vital sign checks? This is compensating, ladies and gentlemen, for lack of modern training." He paused, let the silence breathe, then delivered the punchline. "Nurse Grandma here thinks we're still using paper and prayer." The amphitheater erupted. Not gasping. Laughing. Real, genuine laughter from 60 educated professionals who had just been given permission to mock someone's competence in front of 200 eyes. Margaret watched the amusement ripple through the seats like a wave, and her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't let her hands ball into fists. The calm that came from having survived mortars falling on a Humvee in Helmand province was the same calm that kept her perfectly still now, muscle memory, but the kind that lived in your nervous system, not your reflexes. Pierce finished his slideshow 15 minutes later, the rest of the presentation a blur of his achievements, his research, his plans for modernizing the hospital's protocols. He never mentioned that the patient he'd mocked her chart over had survived. That her excessive documentation had likely saved the woman's life by catching the blood pressure drop at 2 in the morning when a less attentive nurse would have let it slide until shift change. But facts didn't matter during grand rounds. Authority mattered. Audience mattered. The appearance of being in control. Margaret didn't wait for the crowd to disperse. She took the stairs down 2 at a time and was halfway to the break room when she heard his voice behind her. "Margaret." A moment. Dr. Pierce caught up to her by the vending machines, his white coat still perfectly pressed from his performance upstairs. There were 3 nurses pretending not to watch from across the hallway, new residents, probably, still young enough to care about staying on his good side. He positioned himself between her and the machine, effectively cornering her in the narrow space where the break room hallway narrowed. "I've been watching you," he said, and his voice had shifted. No more public performance. This was the practiced concern of a man who'd learned exactly which tone to use. "Really, I have." 2 years now, and I respect your work ethic. But Margaret, I'm concerned. You're what, 58? 59. He didn't wait for an answer. These 12-hour shifts are genuinely designed for younger staff. Your back. Your knees. I've seen you limping after double shifts, and I know you do the doubles. More than anyone else on your unit. He put his hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was supposed to feel paternal and instead felt like a hand on a trapped animal. Maybe it's time to consider part-time work. Or honestly, retirement isn't the enemy at your stage. You've earned rest. For patient safety, of course. The younger nurses need more opportunities, and you deserve to enjoy your golden years. His voice dripped sympathy like honey from a spoon. Loud enough for the residents across the hallway to hear. The kind of concern that sounds like caring but feels like a knife being twisted in a very specific way. The implication was crystal clear: you're old, you're slowing down, you're in the way. Margaret let him finish. Let the silence stretch after his final word. In her experience, people who were comfortable with cruelty were rarely comfortable with silence. Silence was honest in a way their words could never be. Then she met his eyes. The stare was flat and cold as January ice, the kind of gaze that had once made Taliban fighters take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't angry. Anger had too much heat in it, and Margaret had long ago learned to drain the heat from her voice entirely. This was something colder. This was the look of someone who had seen real things, terrible things, things that made office politics and performative concern look like the childish theater they actually were. I've triaged blast wounds in 100-degree heat while mortars fell around me, she said, her voice so quiet that the residents across the hallway actually stopped pretending to work and turned to listen. I've held pressure on wounds in a Humvee rolling through hostile territory. I've made decisions in seconds that meant the difference between a soldier going home or going home in a box. Your paperwork tantrums don't impress me. She reached past him for her coffee cup from the vending machine shelf, her movement smooth and unhurried. The cup was cold. She hadn't even wanted it. She was just reclaiming her space, demonstrating that he couldn't actually trap her, that his authority was something she could move past the way she could move past this machine. Then she turned and walked away. Pierce didn't follow. His mouth opened and closed a few times, working soundlessly like a fish in air. His face went a color somewhere between crimson and purple, and Margaret didn't look back to see it. She could feel it the way you feel someone staring at the back of your head, that particular pressure of attention, of wounded ego, of a man who had just realized that his tools didn't work on everyone. Public mockery didn't work on her. Performative concern didn't work on her. Authority didn't work on her because she'd held an authority that mattered once, and nothing he possessed compared to it. The hallway was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, that particular electrical hum that never quite stopped even when the hospital was supposed to be sleeping. But that wasn't the worst part of what happened next. Friday afternoon came like every other Friday afternoon: too many patients, not enough staff, the kind of controlled chaos that made hospitals hum. Margaret was restocking the supply cart outside Bay 4 when Pierce appeared in the corridor, and this time he brought company. A security guard she didn't recognize. A clipboard. A folder that was clearly labeled with her name from across the hallway. Standard protocol, Pierce announced, loud enough that half the unit could hear. His performative concern was gone now, replaced with something colder. Something final. When employment irregularities surface, we have security oversee the clearing of personal effects from employee lockers. Just want you prepared, Margaret. Nothing personal. Hospital policy. He said it like he was doing her a favor. Like he was helping her understand a natural consequence rather than orchestrating exactly what he'd been planning since the moment she'd embarrassed him in front of 60 people. 3 nurses pretended not to listen from the computer stations. The security guard looked uncomfortable, the way people do when they've been asked to participate in something that tastes like punishment but is being called procedure. Margaret's hands didn't shake as she set down the supplies she'd been holding. But her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, just enough that if you were looking, if you knew what to look for, you'd see it. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the exact same restraint that had kept her from doing something catastrophic when Pierce cornered her by the vending machines. The same restraint she'd learned in a place where anger could kill you almost as effectively as an IED. When? She asked. Her voice was steady. Level. The voice of someone who had already moved past this moment and was simply managing logistics. Today. After your shift. We'll send someone to escort you. He said it like it was generous. Like he wasn't having her removed like a piece of contaminated equipment. Like this wasn't the beginning of the end he'd been engineering from the moment he realized that her charts were going to expose his fraud. Because that's what this really was. This had nothing to do with grand rounds or vending machines or performative concern. This had to do with Margaret knowing exactly what his equipment orders actually cost versus what they were billed for. This had to do with her meticulous charting, creating a paper trail that could be followed backward through 6 years of phantom billing codes. She'd noticed the discrepancies 2 months ago. She hadn't flagged them. Not yet. But she documented them with the same precision she documented everything else, and Pierce had realized that was the same thing as a threat. I understand, Margaret said. And because she'd learned long ago that people like Pierce couldn't handle it when you didn't react the way they expected, she added, I'm going on break. She turned and walked past him toward the break room, and she heard his breathing hitch slightly. The anger. The frustration. The realization that he still couldn't break her, couldn't make her beg, couldn't even get her to acknowledge that this was anything other than a minor inconvenience. Security escort to her locker was supposed to feel like humiliation. But Margaret had carried weapons across hostile territory. She'd made decisions that meant life or death. An audience was just an audience, and nobody in this hospital could scare her. The break room was empty. She poured a cup of coffee and stood at the window looking out at Savannah, at the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks like ghosts, at the rain that was just starting to fall against the glass. She touched the patch inside her jacket one more time, faded now, barely visible even if someone had been looking. The unit insignia was worn almost smooth from her fingers over the past 2 years, the edges soft as cloth that had been touched 10,000 times. Then the code alarm started. Not a drill. A real one. The kind that made the entire unit move as one organism. The ER doors had opened at 6:48 p.m. That was the first thing she heard over the intercom, the tone that meant incoming trauma, the kind of alert that made Margaret set down her coffee and move toward the sound before she even consciously decided to. A man on a gurney, chest pain, vitals dropping, the attending barking orders. And then she heard the name, and everything inside her stopped. Colonel Davis. She knew that name from her son's letters, from the careful way he'd written about his commanding officer with respect that went beyond the usual military hierarchy. The CO who'd looked out for him. The CO who'd recommended him for advanced training. The CO who'd written a personal letter to Margaret when her son had been stationed overseas, telling her things would be okay, that her son was one of the best he'd ever worked with. The colonel who had no idea that his best operative's mother was about to save his life. The ambulance bay doors burst open with the pneumatic hiss of compressed air. The paramedics wheeled the stretcher in at a run, the monitor's rhythmic beeping filling the corridor like a metronome counting down to something none of them wanted to acknowledge. Margaret was restocking the supply cart near Trauma 2 when she heard the radio crackle, incoming, 53-year-old male, crushing substernal chest pain, onset approximately 12 minutes ago, vitals unstable. She didn't look up from the bandage rolls. Not at first. Then the paramedic shouted the name. Colonel James Davis, active duty command, presenting with acute MI symptoms, and Margaret's hands stopped moving. The roll of gauze hung suspended between her fingers. She turned toward the sound of wheels on tile, toward the bay where the stretcher was being lowered, and she saw him. The uniform. The rank insignia on the collar. The face that had written her a letter 3 years ago when her son was stationed in Kandahar, a letter that began with 5 words, "Your son is extraordinary." The 1 second of stillness cost her. She forced her breathing back to its clinical rhythm and moved toward the bay with the same measured pace she'd maintained for 2 years, a nurse, nothing more, just another set of hands in a crisis. The attending surgeon was already shouting vitals. 28-year-old female resident fumbled with the EKG leads. A med student stood frozen near the supply cart, unsure whether to help or get out of the way. Colonel Davis's chest heaved in short, labored breaths. Sweat soaked through his service uniform. His eyes darted around the bay searching for something, control, certainty, anything solid. Then his back arched. His body went rigid. The monitor that had been showing a chaotic rhythm of acute ischemia suddenly flatlined into a single, terrible horizontal line. "He's arresting," someone said. Someone else said it louder. The resident fumbled for the crash cart. The elevator doors had just sealed shut. They were between floors, third level, the gap between cardiology and the cath lab, the 30-second distance that might as well have been 30 minutes. The code blue alarm began its electronic wail, a sound like a siren trapped in the walls, calling for help that was 30 floors away. The resident started chest compressions, counting out loud, 1, 2, 3, 4. Her hands were shaking. Margaret watched Colonel Davis's face. His lips were already losing color. The monitor showed nothing, a flat line, a cessation, the visual representation of a body shutting down. She'd seen this rhythm in Helmand province, on a dust-covered stretcher, in a forward operating base where the only hospital bed was made of canvas and hope. The difference was that in the desert, she'd known exactly what to do. Here, she was supposed to stand back. Watch. Let the system work. The elevator lurched. Doors opened onto the third-floor landing. No one there. No cath lab. No cardiac surgeon. Just an empty hallway and a man dying in the space between help. Dr. Pierce pushed through the growing crowd. His face had that expression it always wore in moments of chaos, the expression of someone about to assert dominance. "Step back, everyone. I'm taking the lead here. Resident, compressions are inadequate, you're not getting proper depth. Move." He didn't touch the patient himself. He never did. He was the conductor, not the musician. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not panic. Not uncertainty. The sensation was colder than that, it was the absence of doubt, the clarity that comes when two worlds collide. She could stay invisible. She could let the system fail, watch it fold under its own incompetence, let Colonel Davis die on a stretcher between floors because protocol required her to do nothing. That was the deal she'd made when she buried Captain Margaret Walsh in Helmand province and became just another nurse in Savannah. Or she could break cover. She moved toward the crash cart without asking permission. Her hands were already reaching for the thoracotomy kit, the sealed plastic pack containing the scalpel, the retractors, the instruments designed for field trauma. The attending surgeon turned to stop her. "Nurse Walsh, Dr. Pierce is handling this, just monitor the..." "He's in full cardiac arrest with no output. You don't have 3 minutes to reach the cath lab." Her voice had dropped. Not loud, but something in its tone made the resident stop counting. "He needs a thoracotomy. Now." "That's beyond your scope," Dr. Pierce said, already reaching for his phone. "Security, I need someone in the third-floor elevator immediately." Margaret tore open Colonel Davis's shirt. The fabric ripped like paper. His chest was pale, the sternum visible beneath skin and bone, the space between his ribs the target. She grabbed the scalpel from the kit, not the standard surgical blade but the emergency instrument, sharp enough to cut through muscle and cartilage in a crisis when precision was a luxury they no longer possessed. The first incision went between the fourth and fifth ribs. The muscle parted under the blade like it had muscle memory of its own, like her hand remembered this exactly, not the hospital lights, not the fluorescent hum overhead, but the sound of mortars in the distance and a soldier bleeding out while the dust settled like ash. Blood welled from the incision, dark and thick. She didn't pause. Her left hand spread the ribs, not with brute force but with the kind of knowing pressure that came from understanding exactly how much the human body could bend before it broke. The intercostal spreader went in. The ribs opened like a doorway. The pericardium was tense, swollen with blood. Tamponade. The fluid was crushing his heart, preventing it from filling properly, strangling his rhythm back into chaos. She nicked the pericardial sac with the scalpel's tip, not a hack, not a desperate wound, but a precise incision. The blood released in a rush, thick and dark, draining away the pressure that had been suffocating his heart. His chest cavity flooded with the reality of what she was doing, what she'd done, what she was now exposed as. His heart shuddered. Then it beat. The monitor showed a blip. Then another. Then a rhythm, irregular, weak, but there. Sinus rhythm. Alive. The attending surgeon stood frozen with his mouth open, the EKG leads hanging from his hands like accusations. The resident had stopped counting. Even the code blue alarm seemed to hesitate, as if the hospital itself was recalibrating what it had just witnessed. Margaret stepped back from the stretcher. Her hands were covered in blood up to the wrists. Her scrubs were soaked from waist to shoulder. She stripped off her gloves in one smooth motion and dropped them into the biohazard bin like she was disposing of the last 2 years of invisibility. Colonel Davis's monitor continued its rhythm, weak but steady, a heart that had been brought back from the edge by hands that belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to exist. Dr. Pierce's face went white. Then red. A splotchy, mottled red that started at his neck and climbed toward his temples. His phone was still in his hand. He was still holding it, but his thumb had stopped moving. His eyes moved from Margaret to the patient to the blood on her hands and back again, as if he was trying to calculate the exact legal threshold of what he'd just witnessed. "Get her badge number," he said, his voice thin and precise. "Get security. Call risk management. She just performed an unauthorized surgical procedure without credentials. That's criminal, that's her license, that's everything. Get her out of this hospital immediately." The attending surgeon stepped forward. For a moment Margaret thought he might defend her. Then he looked at the monitor, at Colonel Davis, at the impossible thing that had just happened in the space of 43 seconds between floors. He looked at her hands. He said nothing. Margaret stripped off the top layer of her scrubs with methodical precision. Her movements were steady, her jaw clenched the way it had been in briefing rooms in Kandahar when she was receiving orders that would define the next 10 years of her life. This was stage 5. This was active sabotage. This was the moment when Dr. Pierce moved from social attacks and strategic maneuvering into the territory of professional destruction, into the arena where he controlled enough of the system to make her disappear. She'd known it would happen. She just hadn't expected it to happen while she was still blood-soaked, still standing 30 seconds away from saving a man's life, still wearing the weight of a decision that had broken the careful distance between Captain Margaret Walsh and Margaret the nurse. The elevator doors opened. The crash team rushed in, too late, always too late. They looked at the patient. They looked at her. One of them, a nurse she recognized from the cardiovascular unit, looked at her hands and smiled slightly before turning his attention to the patient who was now stable enough to survive the ride to the cath lab. Margaret walked toward the surgical waiting area without waiting for security to arrive. She moved like someone walking through rain that didn't dare touch her. Behind her, Dr. Pierce was already on his phone, his voice rising as he explained to someone on the other end what had happened, how it violated protocol, how this was going to end careers, his calculation that if he moved fast enough, if he controlled the narrative before it controlled him, he might survive what was about to come down. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close to the worst part. Within the hour, Dr. Pierce's network activated like a machine designed for exactly this purpose. He called the chief of medicine at home, voice steady and urgent. Unauthorized surgical procedure. Possible falsified credentials. I need a full investigation by morning. 2 board members received similar calls. The hospital's credentialing director got pulled from dinner. By midnight, investigators were already in the medical records room, pulling every chart Margaret had touched in 2 years, stacking them in neat piles on a metal table under fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects. By Thursday morning, the picture Dr. Pierce painted had solidified into something that looked like the truth. He contacted Margaret's references at a Virginia clinic, the one in her application, the one that should have verified her background. The clinic's director confirmed what Pierce already suspected. no one by that name had ever worked there. Never. The employment dates were clean fabrications. The credential verification was fiction. He smiled when he hung up the phone, the kind of smile that belongs to a man who has finally cornered something he's been hunting. What Dr. Pierce didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Margaret Walsh had been erased deliberately. Not by accident. Not by oversight. Operation Copper Shadow had been classified so deep that the Pentagon had made her disappear from every database, every record, every official trace. Witness protection in exchange for silence. She'd agreed to vanish entirely. To become nobody. To work in a hospital in Savannah, Georgia, where the likelihood of exposure was minimal and her hands could still heal people without her history rising up to swallow her whole. But the clinic discrepancy was enough. It was all Pierce needed. By Friday noon, credentialing had pulled her file from active status. Her privileges were suspended pending investigation. Security was instructed to escort her to her locker at shift change and watch while she removed her belongings. Pierce made the call himself, his voice carrying down the hallway with a kind of practiced concern that masked pure vindication. Irregularities in her employment history require immediate termination. It's nothing personal, Margaret, just patient safety protocols. He was there when she arrived at her locker, actually present, holding a cardboard box, making sure everyone saw. Making sure the evening shift watched her sign termination papers at the nurse's station while her colleagues looked away, suddenly very interested in their computer screens. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for a hearing or legal representation. Margaret simply folded her identification badge into the box, packed her spare stethoscope, removed her name from the mailbox. Her movements were precise and controlled, each action identical to those that had preceded it for 2 years, the same measured calm she'd maintained while Dr. Pierce mocked her, while he cornered her by the vending machines, while he planted his sabotage. That evening, Margaret stood alone in the hospital laundry room. The fluorescent overhead lights buzzed their electric hymn. She folded her scrubs for the last time, navy blue cotton with her name stitched in fading thread. Fold. Crease. Smooth the wrinkles with her palms. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from a different life, a life where precision meant survival. She folded each pair of scrubs the way she'd folded field dress uniforms in barracks that no longer existed, in a country she'd vowed never to speak about, in a war that had officially never happened to an operative who had officially never been born. The faded Special Forces patch was still there, sewn into the jacket lining with careful stitches. She could feel it when she reached inside, rough fabric, worn edges, the only physical proof that Captain Margaret Walsh had ever existed at all. Her fingers lingered there for a moment. Just a moment. Then she removed her hands and placed the folded scrubs on the wire shelf. 24 months of careful invisibility, undone in a single afternoon. She couldn't defend herself. That was the trap. That was the price of the deal she'd made 7 years ago when the Pentagon had offered her 2 choices, disappear completely or never see anyone she'd ever extracted again. They'd explained it clearly. Witness protection doesn't work if the protected person starts surfacing in military databases. It doesn't work if old operations suddenly become connected to civilian employees. It doesn't work if anyone, anywhere, starts asking questions about Captain Margaret Walsh and Operation Copper Shadow and a field extraction from Helmand province that the government had never officially acknowledged. If she surfaced now, if she told the hospital board the truth, if she revealed her military service, if she explained that her credentials weren't false but classified, she would trigger cascades. Investigations into the Pentagon's protection protocols. Questions about her identity. Journalists asking why a Special Forces officer was working as a floor nurse in Savannah. And then everyone she'd extracted would be exposed. 12 people whose safety depended on absolute silence. 12 lives scattered across the country, living under new names, attending new schools, working new jobs. All of them believing they were safe because Captain Margaret Walsh had promised them that the operation would stay buried. She walked out of the laundry room into the parking lot. Rain had started falling sometime during her shift, the kind of cold October rain that soaked through everything. She didn't hurry. She didn't run. She simply walked toward her car, unemployed now, untethered from the institution that had protected her while she'd protected it, unable to defend herself against accusations she couldn't legally refute. The dryers behind her continued their tumble cycle, the mechanical hiss like distant helicopter rotors. She didn't look back. The next morning, everything changed, though she didn't know it yet. Monday, 7 a.m. A patient arrived in the ER under federal protection, transferred from another facility, scheduled for witness relocation surgery. A Taliban defector. A man whose cooperation with coalition forces had marked him for death, now moving through the American medical system with armed federal agents on either side of his gurney. Margaret had come in to collect her final paycheck, her signature required on one last set of forms. She wore street clothes instead of scrubs for the first time in months, and the feeling was strange, like wearing someone else's skin. She was passing through the hallway near Trauma Bay 4, staying close to the wall, trying not to be seen, when the patient's head turned on his pillow. His eyes found her face. Recognition flashed across his features like lightning striking water. He whispered something in Dari. Then in broken English, words that carried 7 years of weight, iron 6. The corridor went absolutely still. Every federal agent within earshot turned. The Marine Corps liaison coordinating the defector's security reached for his tablet, his face draining of color. His eye scanned the encrypted files, found what he was looking for, and he started reading aloud before he could stop himself, the words tumbling out like a dam breaking. Captain Margaret Walsh led an extraction under fire that saved 12 lives during operation. Dr. Pierce materialized from the adjacent hallway, his voice shrill and panicked. She has fraudulent credentials. She falsified her employment application. This woman is not who she claims to be. His words were technically accurate. They were also completely irrelevant. He was still talking when the sound changed everything. Rotor wash. Helicopter rotors cutting the air outside, the building's windows rattling in their frames. The sound of a military Black Hawk holding position on the parking lot, rotors hammering the October rain into horizontal sheets. Boots hit the tile in perfect rhythm. Combat boots. Multiple pairs. The sound of soldiers moving with purpose, the kind of purpose that doesn't negotiate or compromise. A 2-star general in dress uniform walked through the ER doors, flanked by 2 Pentagon liaisons in dark suits. The officers moved like a blade cutting through space. The general came to a stop directly in front of Margaret, his bearing so precise it was almost violence. He came to attention. Not casual. Military attention. His right hand rose in a salute. Margaret's hand rose automatically in return, the muscle memory immediate and absolute. Captain Walsh, the general said. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a distant garage. Bronze Star with Valor. The corridor had filled with staff now. Residents. Nurses. Orderlies. Everyone stopped what they were doing. Purple Heart, the general continued. He was reading from memory, not a page. This was ritual. This was ceremony. Meritorious Service Medal. 2 Purple Hearts. And a Navy Cross. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Dr. Pierce's face cycled through colors, red, then white, then a shade of gray that suggested his entire worldview was collapsing. His mouth opened and closed like a fish removed from water. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. The Marine Corps liaison stepped forward, opening a classified folder with hands that moved precisely despite their tremor. Operation Copper Shadow, Helmand Province. Captain Walsh was ordered to disappear for her protection and the protection of those she extracted. She was told never to surface. Officially, she does not exist in any military database. He paused. He was looking directly at Dr. Pierce now, and his expression had hardened into something that suggested he was beginning to understand exactly what had just occurred. And she certainly doesn't exist in any hospital credentialing system, Dr. Pierce. Because she was never supposed to be there in the first place. Monday morning, a Taliban defector arrived by ambulance, gunshot wound to the left shoulder, screaming in Pashto as paramedics wheeled him through the ER doors. Margaret was passing the trauma bay when his eyes found hers. The screaming stopped. His voice dropped to a whisper, rough with pain and something like reverence, Iron 6. Just that. One word. 2 syllables. The entire hallway froze. Paramedics exchanged glances. A resident turned, confused. But Margaret kept walking, her pace unchanged, her expression flat as Arctic ice. She didn't acknowledge him. Didn't pause. That was discipline, the kind learned in places where recognition meant death. By Tuesday morning, the Pentagon's liaison had already arrived. He was a colonel with silver at the temples and the kind of posture that made chairs uncomfortable. He stood in the hospital administrator's office with Margaret's real personnel file, the one that had been sealed since 2010, classified under Operation Copper Shadow. A Marine Corps liaison stood beside him, reading Margaret's citation aloud to the attending physicians, her voice steady and formal. Captain Margaret Walsh led an extraction under fire that saved 12 lives, Dr. Pierce interrupted, his voice climbing toward a shout. This doesn't change anything. Those records are fraudulent. She lied on her application. She violated. The Marine Corps liaison looked at him the way a person looks at something found on a shoe. Continued reading, Bronze Star for Valor. 2 Purple Hearts for combat wounds sustained while protecting her unit during hostile operations. Pierce's face went scarlet. Hospital policy requires. The colonel raised a hand. One hand. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming through the walls like the breath of something vast and unseen. Within the hour, a 2-star general walked through the ER entrance. Not through the administrative offices. Not through the private entrance. He came through the public doors in dress blues, medals catching fluorescent light like copper coins, and walked directly to the trauma bay where Margaret was assessing a patient's bandaging. He didn't ask for permission. He stood at the foot of the bed and saluted, fist to chest, held for 3 seconds, his face a granite landscape of respect. Margaret felt the room's attention like pressure change before a storm. She met his eyes. Said nothing. The general's voice was clipped, formal, the kind of voice that had commanded hundreds of soldiers across 1,000-mile operations. Captain Walsh. On behalf of the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I'm here to present the honors you've earned but were never permitted to claim publicly. He produced a velvet case. Inside, a Bronze Star ribbon and Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster. 2 separate medals, each representing decisions made under fire, blood spilled for people she didn't know, extraction ops that ended in success because she refused to fail. Margaret took the case. Her hands didn't shake. Thank you, sir, she said quietly. 8 words. They somehow contained everything, every night in Helmand, every extraction, every soldier who'd made it home because she'd held the line. The general continued, your service record has been partially declassified for hospital documentation purposes. Operation Copper Shadow was a classified extraction mission spanning 4 years, involving 12 individuals relocated under witness protection. Your meticulous charting during your time here at Seattle General provided crucial evidence of systematic fraud by the Chief of Surgical Staff. He nodded toward Dr. Pierce, who had gone the color of ash. Pierce tried to recover. This doesn't change the falsified employment records. She lied to human resources. She violated. The Pentagon liaison held up one hand, and Pierce stopped mid-sentence like someone had cut his power. The liaison's voice was ice water. Dr. Pierce, when you attempted to verify Captain Walsh's employment history, you contacted a classified facility. When you found discrepancies, you fabricated additional documentation to strengthen your termination case. You altered timestamps on disciplinary reports that never existed. Pierce went very still. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The liaison continued, you forged records to justify her firing. That triggered flags in classified systems. Federal security protocols activated automatically. FBI Cybercrime Division traced your access logs across 3 hospital servers. Outside, through the ER windows, 3 black SUVs pulled into the ambulance bay. Unmarked. Engine ticking after shutdown. Doors opened in sequence. Agents emerged, suits despite the heat, credentials visible, movements that suggested they'd done this 100 times before. The general's voice remained calm, almost conversational. Your attempt to erase Captain Walsh's employment triggered a full audit of Seattle General's procurement records spanning 6 years. Captain Walsh's charting was meticulous. She documented every equipment discrepancy, every phantom billing code, every inflated order you'd submitted. She hadn't reported it yet. She was waiting, following protocols. But her records were perfect evidence. Pierce's hands had started to shake now, actual physical trembling, nothing like Margaret's composure. He was coming apart in real time, his institutional power dissolving like salt in water. The FBI agents walked through the ER doors. Rubber soles on tile. The sound was methodical, inevitable. One held up credentials, federal ID, the seal prominent. Dr. Richard Pierce, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and tampering with federal witness protection documentation. They cuffed him in the hallway where he'd once held court, where residents had stood in semicircles listening to his grand rounds lectures, where he'd mocked Margaret by the vending machines, suggested she was too old to keep up, his voice dripping with performative concern. His voice rose to a shout now. I built this department. I have friends on the board. You can't do this, but they did. They walked him past the ambulance bay in handcuffs, past Margaret standing in her reinstatement paperwork scrubs, her face still expressionless, her eyes tracking him the way a thermal scope tracks movement through darkness. Residents and nurses filmed it on their phones. Pierce's future collapsed in that hallway, medical license suspended pending criminal conviction, malpractice insurance voided, his career reduced to driving a medical supply van after his prison term. Someone would recognize him. Someone would remember. He would spend years delivering catheters and wound vac supplies to hospitals where people knew his name. Wednesday morning, Margaret stood in Colonel Davis's ICU room wearing scrubs again, her real scrubs, her real badge clipped to the pocket, reinstated by unanimous board vote. The patch inside her jacket lining remained invisible, exactly where it belonged. Davis was awake now, color returning to his face like someone bringing a photograph back from fading into gray. Monitors showed steady patterns, sinus rhythm, O2 96%, blood pressure climbing back toward normal. He gripped Margaret's hand with surprising strength, his fingers hard from years of combat operations, and his voice came out rough. Your son never told me his mom was the legend from Helmand. He just said you were a nurse in Savannah. He didn't say you were Iron 6. Margaret's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Not a smile, something more subtle. Recognition. He didn't know, she said. No one knew. That was the point. Davis nodded, understanding the weight of that sentence in ways civilians never could. He's a good officer. You should be proud. I am. The general appeared in the doorway with Margaret's personnel file, the real one, declassified enough for hospital documentation, her full service history available now to the institution that had tried to erase her. Captain Walsh, he said formally, Seattle General has offered you the Director of Emergency Nursing position. The Pentagon has cleared it. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window at the hospital stretched below, the ambulance bay where Dr. Pierce had held court, the trauma bays where she'd saved Colonel Davis's life with combat medicine, the corridors she'd walked invisibly for 2 years. She touched the patch inside her jacket lining one more time. Then she turned back to the general. I accept, she said. At shift change, staff stood when she passed through the nurses' station, not out of pity, but respect. She stopped by the empty office that had been Dr. Pierce's, saw cardboard boxes of his belongings waiting for pickup, his diplomas stacked face down, and felt nothing at all. A young resident approached nervously, his hands fidgeting. I'm sorry I laughed during grand rounds when Dr. Pierce made those comments about your protocols. I should have. Margaret cut him off with a look. 3 seconds of silence that weighed more than words. Then her expression softened. You learned something. That's what matters. She walked to the ER board, picked up a marker, and wrote her name in the attending column. Margaret Walsh, RN, Captain, U.S. Army Special Forces, retired. A nurse whispered to another, "What do we even call her now?" Margaret overheard from across the station. She turned, and her voice came through with quiet authority. "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." She pulled on fresh gloves, the latex snapping like a small acknowledgement, and walked toward the next patient. The hallway parted. Not dramatically, just the natural consequence of respect finally earned and recognized. Behind her, the faded Special Forces patch remained sewn inside her jacket lining, invisible again, exactly where it belonged, not hidden anymore, but classified, acknowledged within secure channels, no longer a burden but a benediction carried into every room where someone needed help. The work continued. The truth had arrived. And Margaret Walsh walked forward into her new life wearing the only uniform that had ever mattered, the invisible one. Thank you for being here. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. And we always love hearing from you. Drop a comment and tell us what state or country you're in.